neote. Ego Dallas Waska hatu te penasquamok, ego man ganigani stoma Creek Confederation, Pugitega Panangamots. Ecto Tao Dallas, Musumpa Nohe, Pete Waska hat, Sam Waska hat, ego Joe Waska hat. Aixaga ega neote. Ego hotan stoge. Ego sita moadan gamo nohe, late Art Musselman, Gordon McGilvery, Jack Bull. Ego negese. Ego itamagot, ega vigats taponi tato mangamon. Wistas egi sagi tatsgoma, pizion, mina patsamon. Pugiteo maski ega pan, nangamotsik. Ego tasim saus semaote, kapanangamotsik, pugitem suite. Examani stapues na naskumoan, mina mamo tau imao na naskumao, ai hai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so sorry. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrea Lopez, and I am a second-year student intern at the UC Santa Cruz American Indian Resource Center. I use she, they pronouns, and I am Lakota. Thank you for joining us for the 25th Amah Mutsun Speaker Series Spring event, Indigenous Santa Cruz, a conversation with Dr. Martin Rizzo-Martinez. The AIRC is dedicated to supporting the needs of American Indian students at UCSC. It is one of 6 research centers on campus. The AIRC is also home to the People of Color Sustainability Collective. Throughout the year, we host speakers, workshops, and presentations that raise awareness about issues that pertain to Indigenous people and other communities of color. It is truly my honor to be here today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Martin Rizzo-Martinez. Dr. Rizzo-Martinez is a state park historian for the Santa Cruz District. His research focuses on the survival and perseverance of Indigenous people in Santa Cruz County. His book, We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in the 19th-Century California, was published in February of 2022. He recently won the Arrington-Prucha Prize for his article exploring how Indigenous women maintain power and influence within the missions. He is a co-producer of the podcast entitled Challenging Colonialism. Chairman Valentine Lopez has been the leader of the Amah Mutsun tribal band since 2003, one of 3 historic tribes that are recognized as Ohlone. He is Mutsun, Awaswas, Chumash, and Yokut. Chairman Lopez is a Native American advisor to the University of California Office of the President on issues related to repatriation. He is also a Native American advisor to the National Alliance on Mental Illness and the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. He is actively involved in efforts to restore tribal Indigenous knowledge, preserve the Mutsun language, and ensure that history is accurately told. He is a traditional Mutsun singer and dancer. So please join me in welcoming Chairman Lopez.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Andrea, for that introduction. Once again, my name is Valentine Lopez, and I'm the chairman of the Amah Mutsun tribal band. And our tribe is comprised of the descendants of the Indigenous peoples that were taken to missions, San Juan Bautista and Santa Cruz. I'm speaking today from the traditional territory of the North Valley Miwok. I live in Galt, which is just south of Sacramento, California. Today's the 25th consecutive Amah Mutsun Speaker Series. This is a tremendous achievement for our tribe and for the university and for the people who have participated and witnessed what has been shared. We've shared a lot of knowledge about historic trauma, about the federal recognition process, about traditional Native American stewardship, and many other topics. Our goal here is to tell the truth of our history and our traditions and our ways and our current day circumstances. And so this right here is a great relationship with the university and the things that we've accomplished in that time. I want to during that time of those of those 25 consecutive Mutsun Speaker Series and more, I know that we wore out a lot of the UC Santa Cruz interns with their speaker series and a lot of other projects, but they've all been so great, and so I want to acknowledge the interns. The American Indian Resource Center, and give thanks and blessings to them and their families. I want to also wish the best to Rebecca Hernandez, who recently left her position as director of the American Indian Resource Center and took a position at the UC Santa Cruz Library. We certainly wish her the best, and she'll continue to be our friend, and we'll continue to work together on projects. Today's topic is with Dr. Martin Rizzo. He's a very good friend of mine, a very good personal friend of mine. I'm very lucky to have met him and to follow him along in his work and to have great conversations with him. And he's a great friend of our tribe. He knows our members and he participates in a lot of tribal events. And that's, and we're grateful and lucky for that. When I was thinking about what to say today, I was remembering the fourth grade, my fourth grade. I was born in 1952. So it's been a while, but it was the early 60s that I was in the fourth grade. And I remember building missions with the popsicle sticks. And I remember hearing the stories that were told by the teacher is that the Indians were treated like children, that they were lucky and very fortunate to come to the missions, that they had a beautiful, wonderful life, that they were saved, and so much more. And when the teacher was saying that, I felt really proud, knowing that that's our history, that they're talking about our backgrounds. But then I started thinking about a lot of other things, like why is it every time I leave the house, I'm told, remember, always say you're Mexican, never say you're Indian. I was taught to never acknowledge that I was Native American Indian. I had to tell people I was Mexican. Also, why isn't our people, why is nothing said about the Indians at the missions? And then why are our people in poverty now? And why do we have to live in fear and shame? That didn't make sense to me, and it didn't jive. And as I got older, I started studying the truth, and it was while studying the truth that Martin became a really important friend and person to tell that truth. Today, you're going to hear from Martin, and you're going to hear a lot of the truth of Mission Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz is recognized as the most brutal of all missions. And Martin and I have spent a lot of times talking about that brutality, that truth. And now that he has his book out there, I'm so glad that others can read and learn of that truth and expose that truth, and so that we can find ways to deal with the historic trauma of the tribes and the soul wounds that the perpetrators, including the teaching institutions that taught those false lies for all those years, must find ways to move forward. So thank you very much, Martin. It's an honor and a pleasure to know you and to listen to your words today. Oh.
Thank you, Val. That really means a lot. I am really grateful for that introduction there. And I'll start by saying I'm really grateful for this opportunity and want to thank the American Indian Resource Center, who I've worked with for a long time and has done lots of wonderful things, including all these talks over the years. I'm going to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you all here from Santa Cruz, which are the traditional homelands of the Uipi people. And this is near the village site of Alintak. And today these lands are stewarded by the Amah Mutsun, who are the ancestral relatives of the Awaswas speaking Uipi people. We'll talk a little bit more, but unfortunately, the vast majority of people from the Santa Cruz area died over the course of this history, right, through the mission era and afterwards. And we'll get into some of those details. But this is a difficult colonial history, of course, that we're talking about. I also want to point out a couple things before I get into the stories here. First of all, I want to say, and I was thinking of this again as listening to Val kind of share his story of fourth grade and everything. And the work that I do, I want to just clarify, as a historian working on these histories and acknowledging that these are not my own histories that I'm working on. But I want people to understand that the history that I write and that other people work on is no substitute for listening to Indigenous people today and hearing their own stories. And when you hear someone like Chairman Lopez talk about his own histories, he's speaking from first-person experience, from family experience, which is a much deeper level and is really important that we all listen to. And so the intention for my research and my writing is really to help kind of provide historical context so that all of us can better understand Indigenous history here, we can better understand and have respect for the strength and resiliency and ingenuity of Indigenous Californian ancestors and Indigenous peoples here today. And so my hope is that as people find my work interesting and read it, that they also seek out and look for the Indigenous communities on the lands that you live on, and working in solidarity and support of the issues that are important to them today. Okay, so I want to just kind of start by clarifying that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And okay, there we go. And today I'm going to share some stories from my book, as people have mentioned, which just came out a few months ago. And before I do that, on kind of continuing what I was just starting to say here, for those who are interested in the work that I've done and the history that I write about, I really think it's really important, again, that people seek out and look for some of the other works by contemporary Indigenous people throughout the Bay Area. And I'm showing you a couple examples. I think it's, if you're interested in my book, it's pretty essential reading. I urge you all to go check out Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda. And as she notes, it's a tribal memoir. So again, she's speaking from firsthand experience of local history. These other books as well, on the far right is Sim Schneider's book, The Archaeology of Refuge and Recourse, which is a fantastic study on his homelands up just North Bay. And then of course, Greg Sarris's new book, Becoming Story, is another fascinating memoir. So I do want to encourage people. Yes, it's great that people are interested in this history, but again, like it's important to support and to learn from Indigenous peoples today. So let's see here. As I navigate the technology, thank you for bearing with me. So my book, as we start talking about it, details the history of Indigenous peoples of the greater Santa Cruz region. But in doing so, one of the themes, the many themes that I work with in my book is looking at the ways that Indigenous communities throughout the greater Bay Area were interconnected through longstanding ties and relationships, collaborations. And I also focus on themes of resistance and rebellion. And I think that it's important to see, and I'll give you an example today of how different Indigenous community members throughout the larger region were able to support each other and kind of find ways to push back and to challenge ongoing colonialism in the area here. So my approach to doing this has been in centering oral histories, and this includes oral histories from back in the 1800s. It includes ethnographic interviews from the early 1900s, but it also includes working closely with tribal members today. As Val mentioned, I worked very closely with Val. I also worked closely with Amah Mutsun tribal historian Ed Ketchum in this as well, who, for those who are reading my book, will see that his voice pops up frequently to offer his insights into things. This map is an example of that. This is a map that was created by Ed and shared with me, and I made some adjustments in the Awaswas territories, but I think I really like this one because it gives a sense of where the villages were and kind of the Indigenous landscape of the area, right? What it was like from the 1700s and before. This here is a map that was actually created at the request of Chairman Lopez. We were talking about visual maps and ways to represent this history, and Val had a wonderful idea where he asked if we could put together a map that would show the impact of Mission Santa Cruz. And I think this, this is a type of map that could be done at each mission, although I believe this is the first I've seen of its kind. I should note that the map itself was made by Annie Taylor, who's a friend of the tribe, who is a grad student up at Berkeley, who very generously worked with me to kind of put this data together. What you're seeing here is there's actually some color coding in this. As you can see below, the darker the colors is showing the larger numbers of tribal members. And these are people over the spans of time that Mission Santa Cruz was working and functioning was about a 45-year period roughly. And in that time period, there were over 35 tribes that were impacted by this, meaning that members were taken from their homelands, brought to the mission here. And you can see these are the tribes that were impacted by this. On the far right of this map, you can see a large bubble that has multiple names. These were Yokuts, tribal members from the San Joaquin Valley. And we have very little information about where their actual location of their different tribes and their villages were because of this disruption. So overall, I mentioned 35 tribes that came in there. There were hundreds of village sites that were completely destroyed by the relocations of people into the missions. And so you can see, I think the best impact of this map in particular is giving us a sense that the missions impacted Indigenous communities way beyond the boundaries of the mission themselves. I think we tend to automatically think that it just had impact right there, but the outreach and the way that in the different communities that were disrupted and completely destroyed through this process was huge, a big level here. So, you know, when Mission Santa Cruz, just a kind of quick note on also, you know, to extend this this point of the impact there, when Mission Santa Cruz was founded in 1791, there were actually discussions about this that were happening up in Santa Clara beforehand. When I went through the records that were held in the Santa Clara baptismal records, what I found is that there were small groups of tribal members from the Santa Cruz Mountains who were arriving there. And there were notes in there saying things like, for example, when one family arrived there, the daughters of this young family arrived and were baptized at Mission Santa Clara. And there's a note there saying that the parents were a couple named Soquel and Rasuem, and people might recognize the name Soquel from Santa Cruz. And they were the lead family from the Uipi tribe, which is the tribe that's where Mission Santa Cruz is eventually founded. And there was a note in there saying that that shows that they were even, you know, planning this out and negotiating it with the tribal members there. So there was an awareness. So and what we see is that when Mission Santa Cruz was founded, they sent down some of the young baptized men from Mission Santa Clara to help kind of instruct people with the new mission founding. So tribes were, you know, of course, to understand this history, we have to look beyond the missions themselves to look at different tribal relations. There are many tribes that were split in half, with half their members sent to one mission, half to another. In fact, that often happened to some of the more powerful tribes as a kind of a tactic to disempower them in some ways. So these histories really kind of extend beyond the mission, even though a lot of the focus of my work was focusing on the Indigenous community that formed at the mission. A couple notes before I get into some of the stories from the book, but I think it's really important that people understand the consequences and the devastating nature of the missions. This is a chart that I put together working with some friends of mine when it's a Tavium family, Caroline and her son Kagan, when they in 2015 walked from mission to mission in protest of the canonization of Hunabro Serra. They asked me to put together an analysis of the numbers of burials and baptisms at each of the missions. What you see here is highlighted Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista, which are the, of course, local closest missions. And what we see here is by the time that the missions closed, in the case of Mission Santa Cruz, over 90% of the people who had been baptized here had died by the point the mission closed. So less than 10% of the people who came through the mission here survived it. It's slightly better at Mission San Juan Bautista with you know, less than 15%. But overall, this pattern is devastating across all of California, but especially so in this region. And I think this is really important for people to understand, because as I'll talk about today, I'm going to give you some examples of people fighting back and resistance. But it's important to understand the context of this resistance, that these were places of great loss. You know, there's conversations right now going on about the boarding schools, and these are important ones, about the cemeteries by the boarding schools. And that should be looked at, but we should also be talking about the cemeteries by the missions, because at each mission site, there are thousands of Native people who have been buried there, and we don't talk about that enough. Of course, indigenous communities understand this, right, when they talk about these histories and why they see these missions as places of great loss and devastation. One more statistic that I want to share with you to help really kind of give a better understanding of this. I did an analysis of all of the Native children who were born at the mission. Overall, Mission Santa Cruz is a little smaller than some of the others, but there was just under 500 Native children who were born at Mission Santa Cruz. When I looked at their rates, I tried to trace out the infant mortality rates, right? How long did they survive? How many did grow and make it to adulthood? And the numbers are devastating. Over 50% of them did not make it to the age of 1. That's over half, right? And then another over 25% didn't make it to the age 5. They died between the age of 1 and 5. And so that means that in some, over 75% of the children who were born at Mission Santa Cruz did not make it past the age of 5. And people ask, what is the context in terms of, what was infant mortality like before the mission was founded? And we can actually know that number. And I did an analysis in the book and I provide the specifics there. But roughly looking at it, what I did was I looked at all the archaeological digs in the Bay Area of cemetery sites. We have thousands, of course, of burials that have been documented in this way over the last 150 years. And I aggregated those and looked at it. And what we found is actually almost the opposite of this, where by those records, people counted age 16 or 17 as being adulthood. And what we find in all of those put together is there an average about 80% of children before the mission, indigenous children in the Bay Area, were making it to adulthood. So it's almost exactly inverse. And adding on to that is that I'm looking at numbers, from 1 to 5, not to adulthood. So again, this idea that the missions brought along with them, as Chairman Lopez mentioned in the beginning, that brought all these wonderful things. When we look at the survival rates, when we look at the death rates, it's hard to argue that there was much positive that was done here. There was much loss. Okay. So that's the context of this. But I gotta tell you a story, probably one of the most infamous stories of that's associated with Mission Santa Cruz. And this is the story that is the reason why in some of these records I find Mission Santa Cruz is referred to as the mission of Padre killers. And this is spoken by some of the Padres in these kind of threatened tones in some of their letters. But in 1812, there was a Padre at Mission Santa Cruz who was named Andres Quintana. And Padre Quintana was known for being very sadistic and for his harsh beatings of people there. In fact, he had just fashioned a special whip made with iron tips that would cut deeper. In the fall of 1812, after Quintana had beaten 2 young men nearly to death, a group of around 20 men and women gathered together to discuss what they should do about this Padre. And they ultimately decided that they needed to assassinate this priest and take care of him in this way. And we know the details about this primarily because of the oral history of a fellow named Lorenzo Asisada. And Asisada's account, this is a picture of the transcript of it that's in the Berkeley archives. But Asisada was born in 1820, but his father had been involved with the assassination, had been one of the conspirators involved. And so in 1870s, Asisada had the opportunity to do some interviews and was able to kind of record this story that gave a really important firsthand account of this, where he remembered details of who was involved and everything. And in my work, I worked very closely with this record, but I took all of the baptismal registries and the burial registries, and I took the names from this story and started to seek them out and put it together to try to understand who exactly were the people involved in this and what were the details. And in doing so, I realized that we actually can find out quite a bit of detail about this particular event. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the stories involved with this assassination. So in Asisada's account, one of the things he talks about is he never mentions this woman by name. He only calls her the wife of Julian. But in the reading of this, you realize that There's a woman who is at the center of this story. And this is somebody who played a very key role in this. And her name was Yakenensat, although she was baptized and given the name of Fausta. So I started looking at the story of Yakenensat, and she's from the Sumu tribe, which you can see on this map here. They're from the Pacheco Pass areas, the Tomoy and Sumu, which is one of the Mutsun-speaking Ohlone tribes who, right on the border of Yokut's territories. And what I found with Yakenensat is I realized that she was actually a leader within this community. And I should point out that for tribes of this area, men and women could be leaders, both political and spiritual leader. In the case of Yakenensat, I believe she was a spiritual leader, and this is partly from different clues that are in the records here, including one particular record that lists her as being a monja, which is a nun, but I think it's a reference to her own spiritual standing within this, within her community here. So Yakenensat arrives at Mission Santa Cruz in 1807. And so about 5 years before the assassination, she married one of the local leaders, a fellow named Laca, baptized as Julian. And she appears in a couple different records here, but in the particular story of the assassination of Quintana, she appears in multiple capacities. She's credited by Assassination for proposing the plan on how to take care and kill Quintana. And that plan included she was going to go to the Padre and tell him that her husband was dying and that he needed to come administer last rites. And her husband was the gardener whose house was right in the middle of the mission plaza there in the lands. And so this would kind of put Quintana into a situation where the others could surround him and kill him. And so this was the plan that they used. And in fact, as Asisara relates, what they did was they did draw him out there, and people refused to actually assassinate him the first time. And so he administered last rites and went back. At this point, Yakenensat said, hey, you have to carry through this. I'm going to go do it again. So she called him out there again. And once again, they failed to carry through with this. And so on the third time, she said to them, if you do not carry through with your side of things, then I'm going to tell the Padre what is happening and reveal this plot. So you can see here, she was really the key figure in this, right? She was at the center of this whole story. And such an important part of this whole thing. And that third time, they did carry through and they did assassinate the Padre. I want to dig deeper on this, and I was thinking a lot about the strategy that she came up with, and I think when we look deeper into the strategy, we realized that this is a plan, a type of strategy that was developed beforehand as she imported into this mission community, and so it's a great example of kind of communication across these lines here. When I looked back previously, and note that Yakenensat arrives at Mission Santa Cruz 1807. There's an event that happened in 1805 that sheds a lot of light on things. There was a Padre up at Mission San Jose named De la Cueva, and De la Cueva was in some ways similar to Quintana. He was also known for being abusive. He had a tendency to drink. In those stories, in fact, not only is he abusive towards Native people, but he's also abusive towards some of the other missionaries and some of the other settlers who were up in the area. And in 1805, De la Cueva is asked to administer last rites to a baptized Native person who is out in one of the villages and who is apparently dying. And so he's sent to go administer these last rites to the Asarin village, but he's actually brought by scouts to a different village site, the Luecha village site, where he is ambushed. There's a soldier that was killed in this event, and this is notable. It was the first Spanish soldier that was killed by indigenous people in the Bay Area. De la Cueva himself was shot with an arrow, although he survived. He kind of holed up there and he got out of there. He's eventually sent back to Mexico City not too long afterwards, and there are stories of him down there getting drunk and threatening at knife point some of the other missionaries. So this is, again, another person who with anger issues and with a streak of violence, right? When I looked at this story, and the first thing that I noticed that popped out at me was this strategy, right? They were asking this priest to go administer last rites, and so I started thinking about what was going on here, right? This is a very similar thing to what Yakenensat does at Mission Santa Cruz. And I started thinking about and learning about indigenous funereal ceremonies, right? The types of things that people of the Bay Area did. And one of the things that the Native people of the Bay Area did was that they, when it came to funerals and burying people, there was a system of doing so, and where some families would take care of the other family. So if there was mourning in one family, one of the people from the other, what anthropologists call moieties, or the other clans. So say somebody from Bear Clan would have died, and so members of Deer Clan would have stepped forward and taken care of the funeral itself, taking care of the body, and allowed the space for those people to grieve, right? So this was a ritual of social cohesion, right? It brought together different families, it brought together different peoples in a way that was super important, right? You can imagine the importance of taking care of a loved one at the time of passing. And so the other hallmark of Spanish colonialism and Catholic Franciscan colonialism in particular is that there was a belief, right, that Native practices were bad or evil, right, these types of ideas. And so there was an insistence on performing Catholic ceremony instead of Native ceremony. And so you can see here where on one hand, where the rituals of funerals would be so important to kind of keeping this cohesions and keeping going, and also the awareness would grow that the Franciscan missionaries would insist upon doing their last rites, and so we have to ask the question, was this a specific strategy where they realized that if they said, hey, somebody's dying, then the priest would insist, go out of his way to get over there to go administer this, and then they could get them at a point where they might be able to do something and attack them. So it seems certainly right that it was, or maybe it happened the first time and they realized, hey, this is a great idea, we can do this. But neither way, you can see the consistency there. I should point out that where this all took place was about 50 miles north of where Yakenensaw's lands were. So it seems to me that she would have absolutely heard about what had happened here. And so when she arrives at Mission Santa Cruz a few years later, this is an opportunity for her to suggest, and she does suggest, hey, let's do this strategy. So I think we find here that there is this very this communication of these strategies and ingenuities that are developed, right? Strategies of resistance that move across these communities of the Bay. A couple other things to mention about the assassination here. One of them is, what I found really interesting, and you see the demographic numbers, is at the point when this took place in 1812, the vast majority of the people involved with the assassination came from the local Awaswas tribes. In fact, the only one who was not a member of the Awaswas tribes was Yakenensaw, who had married into those families as well. So the assassination itself was done by the local tribal members, even at a point, and I give the demographics in 1812, where you can see that the Awaswas speaking Ohlone people made up about 20% of the total population there. And again, this is a reflection of the same dynamic I mentioned at the beginning, where over the years, people are dying. People from the local tribes are dying in great numbers. And again, this is a mix of disease and poor treatment of the type of abuses going on here. And there is a constant influx and need for soldiers to be bringing in other Native people from further and further away. And so the demographics within the mission shift as larger numbers of Mutsun speaking people, and then eventually of Yokuts people. And at the time in 1812, it's almost exactly the same, 37% of both the Mutsun and Yokuts. But again, the Awaswas speakers are a minority there. The other thing about this, I'll show you a chart I made. So these were after the assassination took place. The oral history tells that night, so young men and women were locked up. Native men and women were locked up in their dormitories at night. This particular night, after they did this, they got the keys, they unlocked it, and they had a celebration. So the whole community, their indigenous community at Mission Santa Cruz, knew about this. And yet, what they did was they made it seem like it had been natural causes, and they concealed this, and they kept that secret for, it's not quite clear when the word got out, maybe a year, possibly 2 years after this. So for a good amount of time, this secret was kept there. And they were able to trick people into thinking that it had been a natural causes. But eventually word gets out. A soldier overheard some people talking about it and understood the native language enough. And so they arrested a group of men, marched them to San Francisco. They had a trial there, and they eventually gave sentences to 9 people for this. And these are the people here. I kind of list information about them. You'll notice that most of them died. So they were sentenced to a variety, either 6 or 10 years at the Presidio, and they were almost universally given 200 lashes. And most of them did not survive their punishment. Punishments at the Presidio, they were made to do hard labor. They were given these lashes. It was a dire situation at those, even worse than at the missions. And so only 2 people survived their sentences. One of them moved back to Santa Cruz. And the other, I was finally able to trace him out. It was really difficult to find him, but he was, because he lived on the peripheries. He left, survived his sentences, and then lived out in the forest down in the Big Sur area. But what I want to point out to you here is that one of the people in particular, notice the fellow named Lino right in the middle of the chart here. Now, Lino was a young man. In fact, I mentioned a little bit about the infant mortality rates that were happening at Mission Santa Cruz. Lino was, at the time of the assassination of 1812, he was about 18 years old. And at that point, he was the oldest child who had been born at the mission there. And as the oldest child who was born there, who had survived, right? There was children born before him who didn't survive. But as the first child really to reach adulthood, he was given a particular place amongst the missionaries. In fact, he was the personal page of Quintana. So he worked very closely with him. In fact, when I looked at and started putting together who were some of the other people involved here, his father was the fellow a couple above him. Ules was his native name. Andres was the name he was baptized with. That was the father of Lino. His uncle, Lino's uncle, Ules's brother, was Sirente, which is Fulgencio right below him. And so when I started looking, I realized that actually all the people involved were an extended kinship group. They were all related, right? Some of them were godparents to the other person. And so they were part of the local tribes. They were very closely tied in this network here. And we also know from some of the other accounts that Lino was one of the people who was targeted by Quintana. Now, we know from the story and other things we put together, he wasn't one of the 2 who were beaten nearly to death, because we know who they were. But he was also somebody who had been victimized at the hands of Quintana. And so he understood him really well. And so I want to talk a little bit more about Quintana. And I want to tie this together with the title of my book. Some of you might be wondering, where does this come from, that we are not animals? And it's very closely tied to Lino. This is a quote from the oral history that Assisara provided in 1877. And I'm going to read this to you. And this comes from, as Assisara is describing the moment I mentioned earlier, that 2 young men had been beaten nearly to death. And so they called together a group of about 20 men and women. And this is the meeting where they discussed, what are we going to do about the Padre? And so the quote that's attributed, again, this is given by Assisara, but this is what he says is Lino's credited for the one standing up and speaking to this. And the quote says, "The first thing we need to do is to keep the Padre from having the desire to punish people in such a manner." And they're talking about the whip that he's making. And he says, "For we are not animals." He tells us in his sermon, right? And keep in mind that Lino is the page, which means he's assisted Padre Quintana in his ceremonies. He knows very much about what he says versus what he does, right? And he tells us in his sermon that God does not command this type of punishment in his example or doctrine. So tell me then, what are we to do with the Padre? Run him off? We cannot do, nor can we take him before a judge, since we do not know who commands him to do what he does to us. It will be better if we kill the Padre without anyone knowing about it, not even the pages nor anyone else, only those who are here present. Now, of course, as I mentioned, other people do find out about it and they're able to keep this, but there's a lot of layers to this story, a lot of different things here. I mean, I'll point out, we won't get into it, but there's clearly a great understanding here of Lino of the teachings that he has, right? And he's pointing out this hypocrisy between, what he's saying in the pulpit and what he's actually doing. But there's also this awareness. Notice he says, we can't appeal to a judge, right? It's really interesting, right? He's well aware that this system, right, this Catholic Franciscan system doesn't provide an opportunity for Native people to appeal, right? Because there is nobody that they can go to above the Padres. They are the authorities in this. But I want to focus here on this line in particular when he says, "We are not animals." And the original Spanish, of course, is "No somos animales," which is "we are not animals." And I use this, I thought it was a very powerful quote, but I also think there's a lot of layers to what is he talking about here. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what does Lino mean when he's saying, "We are not animals." And to understand that, I started thinking about what is the difference in meaning, what do animals mean for indigenous peoples of the area versus what do animals, how do Spanish colonial peoples engage with animals? And those differences, I think, help explain, help us to better understand what exactly he means by this. So in indigenous society, animals played a lot of important roles. First of all, the relationship that Native people had to animals was one of interrelationship. They had spiritual connections with them. Native people, animals visited them in their dreams to bring them messages, to impart knowledge, songs, medicine. There's a lot of things that they would learn from them. Animals were referenced in places, and I'm showing you some village site names on the right here. The suffix "tak" it means the place of, right? And so there's a lot of village sites, many village sites that end with "tak" or "taka," which means place of. And some of those are in reference to animals. I mentioned Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz was known as Aulintak, which we know that Alon means the red abalone. So that means it's the place of the red abalone. In Watsonville, there was a village site that was called Tiyuvta, which is, again, the "ta" is at the end, and it means the place of the Tule elk. Tu was the Tule elk. Ipitak was another village name, which is the rattlesnake, place of the rattlesnake. Orestak is another one, and Ores was bear. And so animals were often connected and tied together with places. With particular village sites, they had significance in those areas, and they could be, they were in connection with these. I mentioned before that, people were divided into clans, right? When we talked about the mortuary customs. And so one clan might be Deer Clan, another would be Bear. So, people affiliate themselves with certain animals in this kind of way as well. Families did. So there was a sense of reverence, a sense of kind of honoring of animals. Of course, animals were referred to in songs, many songs. There were different songs for different animals. There were different teachings to them. So there was a very much a connection there. And this made me think too, when he says, "We are not animals," right? I mean, there's ways to think about this and say, well, what is he really critiquing here, right? Is he critiquing the animals? And then you think of the relationship that Native people have, and it seems to suggest that maybe that isn't exactly where he's going with it on this. So I started thinking, okay, what do animals mean in Spanish society? So when Spanish colonizers arrived here, along with their own, they brought their own crops, and so they would start planting, potatoes and onions, and wheat and all the different things that they brought up from Mexico City. But along with that, they also brought livestock with them. And it should be noted that both livestock and crop rows take up a lot of lands. And of course, these lands, as we know now, we better understand today, were very carefully tended by Native peoples, right? Native peoples of the California really have the most sophisticated and beautiful basketry of anywhere in the world. And this is because of the diversity of grasses that are available, the many different types of grasses that were there. And these were tended and these were replanted and they were grown in these fields. When the Spanish arrived and started the missions, the thing they did immediately was they set people to work tilling those fields, right? Destroying those fields, basically destroying these resources that were readily available, and then planting Spanish crops there. Livestock, as people know, take up tons of pasture lands, right? And so many of these important resources, these areas, were then turned into lands for the cattle that were brought up here, for the horses, for the mules, for the sheep, for the pigs, for the chicken, right? So all these different animals that were brought up with them. But on top of the environmental impact and devastation that these animals brought, or the fields for these animals did, there was also a very different relationship in terms of controlling things. And this is even just notable in the difference between livestock, which are penned in and controlled, versus wild animals, right, that were on their own and had their own homelands and their own ways of being. And of course, the Spanish had very much all these livestock. So it was about dominating these particular animals. So, these animals, these are, beasts of burden that were used there. And the Spanish brought with them instruments, right, that were used specifically to control these animals. So for cattle, they were given yokes, which would keep the cattle in line, right, kind of keep them there. They used goads, which were whips, right, to kind of control them and to make them go in certain directions. And I should note too that with all of the missions, with any of the work that was being done, or even in the pueblos like the Villa de Brasforte across the way, the Spanish missionaries, the settlers coming up from Mexico City, they didn't do the majority of the work, right? The work was all done by Native people. Whenever there was an adobe that was being built, they would call on Native people and make them do the building. Of course, they didn't get paid for this. This is not paid labor. This is much more akin to Southern plantation slave labor, for which there are certain parallels, of course. But so it would have been the Native people who would be doing all this. They would be instructed by them on how to treat the animals, how to move them. And so you can see where I'm going with this, but thinking then of Lino and his understanding of this, right? You can see where he's putting together these connections. Now, I'll pause to say that there are many debates today about how we should best understand the missions, how we can understand them historically in California. And there's conversations where people debate whether or not, for example, Ben Madley recently wrote an article suggesting that they were similar to California's first penal system, right, to a prison type labor system. And there are certainly some parallels there, right, in some ways, but it's not a perfect comparison, but there are some ways that it does work. Some people have kind of debated whether or not they might be similar to concentration camps. And there's an argument there to be made there. Certainly when we look at those, the rates of people dying and the high numbers, those are comparable to concentration camps. People might debate about the intentions behind them. The Spanish wanted them to be citizens and this and that. And sure, there are debates about those. But when you look past, whatever possible understanding of intents are to the actual just numbers, there's a good argument to be made that it is very comparable to concentration camps. People are dying in very similar numbers. I think Auschwitz had 85% of the people die. So Mission Santa Cruz actually had a higher percentage of people dying than Auschwitz. So other people argue that missions were idyllic, benign places where, all these things, of course, we know these are built on fantasies. But where I want to weigh in here is that with all these arguments about, what other institutions it might be similar to and what degree, I think that the best way that we can really understand the missions is by looking at how did Native people of the time understand the missions themselves? How did they understand the treatments that they were getting there? And this takes us back to Lino's statement and why I think it's so important when he says, we are not animals here. When Lino is looking at this, right, and again, he is amongst his other folks there, they are all the ones who are tending the animals. They are the ones who are, who are putting this all together and, taking care of the animals and responsible for them in the fields. And there's no doubt that he sees the connections, right? He sees them. I mentioned that that the cattle are and the oxen are using, these yokes to do them. Well, one of the first things that was brought to Mission Santa Cruz is they wrote a letter and said that we need to bring stocks so that we can control Native people. I mean, this is within a couple months of the founding of Mission Santa Cruz. They brought stocks there. While the Padres would use these goads to whip, the mission, the cattle into, do things. They also used the same whips on Native people, right, in the same ways. On top of that, so I mean, there's parallels, right, in the treatment, the types of instruments that they're being used on them. But on top of this, the overall treatment of the Spanish there was one that was dehumanizing, right? It didn't look at them as human beings. In fact, it treated them in a much more similar way to the way that they were treating livestock. There's another example of this in Asisara's oral history, where he gives all sorts of examples. And one of these examples, he talks about how there is a Yokuts couple who arrives at the mission and they are unable to bear children, right? Now, keep in mind that with the demographic numbers and people dying, that is very much what the Spanish are focused on. The missionaries are focused on. They want them to have children. They want them, right? This is their workforce, right? They are, wanting them to do this. And this is where I think there are parallels to animal husbandry that happen here. In fact, in this particular story, I won't go into all the detail on this. You can certainly read about it. The details are pretty horrific. But the Padre at the time is Padre Olbes, and he basically inspects the body of the male and the female, the man and the woman here, and he inspects them. He actually has them have sex in front of him. Makes them do this, right? All against their will, of course. Asisara talks about how they fight back, how they push back. The woman scratched, Olbes's face, and good for her. She's fighting back against this type of treatment. But that whole story itself, on top of being horrific and terrible, and I should note that in the end, the Padres punish her for her inability to bear children by making her carry a wooden doll. And what I found is that this is not the only place that happens. There's other stories of women who are unable to conceive being forced to carry wooden dolls. This is like a psychological torment, right? On top of that, as if it's bad enough having to deal with this and all this other abuse, right? And they made the husband to wear antlers, they said, which is some kind of, again, like a kind of like reducing him to an animal, to a beast. And so this, to me, this really has this parallels to animal husbandry. I mean, this is very much the same thing that farmers would do to try to get, cows to reproduce or have things. This is a very dehumanizing system, a very dehumanizing process all the way through on this. And so I think that if we want to better understand, the missions, if we want to understand, what is happening and how Native people are understanding this, I think that it's to understand these as a very dehumanizing system, right, where Native people were treated as animals. And so, what does it mean when Lino says, we are not animals? Coming back to that in the title here. I don't think it's a refutation of animals, or he's trying to distinguish, right? We could look at this biologically now today and say, oh, he's saying, like humans are different from animals. And that's clearly not what he's talking about. But instead, he's critiquing this difference in, on multiple levels, right? On one level, he's critiquing the way that Spanish deal with animals, right? In some ways, the relationship that they have, in contrast with this relation that's built on reverence and respect in this kind of interrelationship. But he's also critiquing the way that Native people are being treated. And he's pointing out that when he says we are not animals, why does he treat us this way, right? He's saying, he's drawing those parallels, and he's pointing out how the Native people at the mission themselves are doing that. So ultimately, when Lino asserts that we are not animals, it's a rejection of this treatment, of being treated in a similar way to how the Spanish treat their animals. And it's a rejection of the dehumanizing treatment at the hands of Padres like Quintana and so many others. Okay. Well, I think I know I'm probably a few minutes actually early here too, but I'm gonna wrap up my stories with that, and I see that there are some questions in here, and I'm super happy to go in and talk about those, or to answer and address those questions. I'll point out here for those who are interested in getting a copy of the book, there's a couple ways that you can do that. If you are in Santa Cruz Bookshop, Santa Cruz does have copies of it there, but Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks has very generously offered to sell the book at a 40% off discounts. There's a link right here on the top that people are welcome to use. I guess I can also link to that too, and share that in the chat box, which I'll do. And then also, if you wanted to order it from the publisher itself, I do have a 40% off code that you can use there as well, which is 6AS 21 that people can use. Anyway, a little bit of information there, but let me transition to the questions here and see what we have. Okay, so there's a question from Lou. It says, regarding the geographic area of Mission Hill, where the final Santa Cruz mission was located, can you give some insights into the pre-mission period history of the region? Yeah, to some extent. I mean, a couple things that are noteworthy for those who know Santa Cruz area. I should point out that the mission, well, first of all, the mission was not founded up on the bluff. Initially in 1791, the mission was built down in the area that would be now downtown Santa Cruz, and it was flooded out, right? So there was basically a winter came and it flooded everything, destroyed some of the buildings. So then they built it on the bluff. Part of the reason that it's founded on the bluff, for those who are familiar, when you come down High Street, right? If you're coming from the university down, if you're driving down High, which is one of the ways to come down, you'll see actually the part of Holy Cross today, right? The church that's right there, you can see it. And that's because the High Street itself was known as the Zanja. It was where the aqueducts up on the west side Santa Cruz eventually was known as a rancho in the rancho era, after the mission era, as Tres Ojos de Agua, right? 3 eyes of water, because of the springs, the natural spring water up there. And so there were those springs, had been there for a long time. Of course, springs are very important sacred sites where water is coming from. When the Spanish built it, they wanted it to kind of, bring the water down there for the irrigation and everything else. But you're asking about prior, so that's kind of pointing out a little bit of the terrain. I will say, I mentioned Alintak as a village site. We do understand that Alintak was the name of the village where kind of downtown Santa Cruz is. We know from the archaeology that's been done that there's likely a village site up on Mission Hill, which is just above the boardwalk in that area. There's a lot of archaeological sites there. And so it's likely that Alintak, now native villages were not kind of dots on a map. They were broader territories. Over time, people would shift where they were. So the impact was a little less in terms of kind of human impact. They would seasonally rotate, and so there was like a rotation of burnings to kind of replenish things. So I would say that whole downtown area was probably Alintak, although much of downtown would have been kind of a marshy area, kind of like Neri Lagoon these days. So the village, when we think of Alintak, I kind of think of it as that whole area, maybe even Mission Hill there, or where the mission eventually was part of the that area that was known as Alintak. Okay, and people have questions, please feel free. I see a couple more on here. I'll move to the next one. Let's see, I'll come back to Luz again because there's another one here. Well, let me do it. Regarding the Ohlone Coast-Noan language dialects, referred to as a Waswas, I know that there's scholarly disagreement regarding if a Waswas was a formal language dialect or if it's a term applied to what were actually different distinct dialects. Generally, the term Waswas is used to refer to a particular geographic cultural area. Yeah, so Lou here is referring to Waswas is kind of understood as a language of people of the Santa Cruz region. Now, the boundary lines between different Ohlone languages are very much debated. Our information on that is very limited. In fact, what we know and how we understand it today is is largely built on the work of anthropologists who kind of built language maps of California, right? So there is some debate. I know in my conversations with tribal historian, Amah Mutsun tribal historian Ed Ketchum, Ketchum pointed out to me that the name Awaswas, he has a theory that it's possible that Awaswas is a Mutsun word for that area, and in fact, I want to say a was part of the word itself has some Mutsun roots that mean kind of like northwest, maybe. So there's some interesting thoughts on that. I think that's entirely possible. We do know from ethnographic interviews from early 1900s that a couple people, in fact, Josefa Velasquez is noted as one of the last Awaswas speakers, and Miss Velasquez is one of Chairman Lopez's ancestors and one of the ancestors of the Amah Mutsun people. So yeah, so there's some debate about it. We don't quite know what the line is. Most people accept that the Año Nuevo area was around the northern boundary, but we really don't know if the Quiroste people up there spoke Awaswas or if they spoke, or if they spoke Rumatush, north of there. So it's an open question on that. But yeah, we're still trying to piece things together. Unfortunately, so much of that information is we're left to kind of build on it. So somebody asked, could Lino's comments also be biblical in terms of challenging and Padre's preaching about the creation of human beings having dominion over animals and not over people? Yeah, I think that's a great point, actually. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is an interesting point, right? It kind of ties in with this biblical idea of dominion over animals. Yeah, I think it's a great point, actually. Lino absolutely, as the page, as the assistant to Quintana, he would have been very well versed in the Bible, right, in the teachings there. So absolutely, I think that's an excellent point. Thank you. Okay, and somebody, Felisa, asked about who's pictured on the cover. Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't talk about him here. I did talk about him in a talk I gave at the MA recently. The cover of the picture is a drawing from a photograph of a man named Justiniano Rojas. And Rojas was a survivor of Mission Santa Cruz. He lived in the Santa Cruz area. It was kind of became famous when a couple photographs were taken of him, and they misidentified him and thought that he was 128 years old. And this is part of a whole other story. I talk about it a lot in the 6th chapter, I think, of my book, but there is this fantasy, American fantasy of these ancient Indians, and it was used. His story became internationally famous. Images of him appeared in journals internationally, and it was part of a kind of a selling of California. Like, come to California. The dying Indians lived 130 years. It's very strange stuff. But anyway, I talk about in the book the actual story of Rojas, because there's a mythology that was created around him. And even in Santa Cruz, there's a Rojas Street, and there was a parade in the 1960s where they had Chief Rojas, and all this kind of local lore around him. But I do talk about his real story, and the actual story I think is a lot more intriguing and more powerful. Good question. So let's see. Moving on, it's great. A lot of good questions here. Somebody wrote here. I was fascinated dissertation about Indian Geronimo and his wife Barbara and their roles in the area. Yeah, Geronimo was Shaguit, was his native name, and he was. I talk about him a lot in the book in chapter 6. Just so you know, Barbara, the book goes much more into depth over this dissertation, but thank you for that. Yeah, I think that story is very fascinating. Just really quick on that. When Mission Santa Cruz was finally closed, Hartnell came from mission to mission to report on what the state of things. Of course, Native people were supposed to have been given all of those lands, and they were not at any of these, and they were kept there. They were not emancipated until after almost 10 years after they were supposed to be. When they arrived at Mission Santa Cruz, Hartnell says that Geronimo said, I'm old and tired and I want my lands. And he was given, those who know Santa Cruz on the west side, there's a West Lake. Geronimo and Barbara and their kids lived right there on the side there. And really interesting story. There's some fascinating stories of Geronimo and Barbara that come from that time. He was, kind of entrepreneurial and sold, goods to people, spoke highly of him from kind of the Mexican community there. They would go there and buy stones from him too. He was a Mason. Very interesting for sure. All right, I'm going to move on because there's a lot of questions here too. And Washayo wrote, in your research, have you found much in regards to accounts missing or gaps in regards to issues that happen with Native populations? I'm curious on early historical editing of accounts in the mission records and or later retractions. Yeah, absolutely. A great question. I'm sure that there's much more too. I think the most notable to me is that when I think of fugitives, people leaving the missions, right? I think that was happening way more than it's been written about. I think that they underreported, and I think it has to do with, every year the missionaries would write their numbers. So they would write out, this is how many people we have here, and they would send that in, right? These are the annual reports, and I think that they over-reported them for probably funding purposes, so they get goods sent to them. But I find one example in 1798 at Mission Santa Cruz where they say in that actual report, they say there's, I want to say 350 people. And there's a letter that's maybe 2 weeks away from that where the same missionary writes a letter and he says, oh, something about like those 150 people still haven't returned. They're still fugitive, right? So then you take it back and it's like, wait, he's reporting 350 and there's 150 people missing. It's probably 200 people there. And he's writing it that because he doesn't want to admit that they're gone, that they haven't returned, that they don't know where they are. So I think that absolutely there's those types of gaps in big ways. Oh, and maybe even a better example of that too from the Mexican era. There's a story that Chairman Lopez talks about a lot where in the oral histories of the Amah Mutsun, where they talk about a massacre that took place in Orastimba. And for many years, people would say, historians say, well, there's no evidence of this. And then, it turns out there was an interview by Frank Latta of the grandson of a Spanish soldier who describes the same exact massacre. This was reported in 1930, the interview. And the soldier himself says, my grandfather was told never to report this or talk about this. And he told it to my dad and I out of guilt, right? Because he was carrying this burden of this massacre. So that to me is a perfect example of why oral histories are so much more reliable and important than the official records, which can be doctored around those types of omissions. So yeah, again, just a fantastic question. I think there's a ton of those. Okay, Chris, question from Chris says, I was curious if there were info in the archives on how Lino and the others strategized and successfully killed the Padre while making it look like a death in natural causes. Was this task complicated by giving him a poison, suffocation? Great question. And there's some layers to that, probably more than I can get into. Well, I got a few minutes. So yeah, so let's see. It sounds like what they did was they strangled him, although there's some conflicting reports, right? And actually this brings up another element of this. Part of the story of Quintana says that he was castrated, according to some, and others say something along those lines, right? I think that is tied. I know this isn't your question, but that element of the assassination is tied to the sexual abuse that Quintana was doing. There's another oral history from a Canadian traveler who talks about how 40 years after the assassination, where he says that the rumor is that he was killed because he had taken advantage of a young woman, right? And so sexual abuse seems to be tied to this. I think that's part of the story. As far as how they did it, I think what they did was they put him back into bed and they made it look like he had died in his sleep, and they kind of locked the door. They waited for the soldiers to come. There's some unanswered things here though, because there is there was an autopsy that was done even to see if it was foul play, and the autopsy guy is a fellow named Miguel Quijano, and according to Quijano's report, he says that that there wasn't foul play involved. So it's kind of this weird question of what was he finding then? I mean, how did he not find this? So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer in that, but more questions. So it's one of those questions that I think leads to a lot more questions. And there's just a lot of different stories that kind of conflict each other a little bit in this. But yeah, another good unanswered question with that. Okay, we have one from Sim. Hey, Sim. Good talk. Considering the catastrophic loss of Native people in Santa Cruz area, are there accounts from Indigenous people or colonizers visiting empty villages or perhaps villages reoccupied by others? You know, that is a great question, Sam. And for those who don't know, I know I mentioned it earlier, but I really urge you to check out his book. Sim is one of the getting us all to think about movement in space beyond the missions and people going back to ancestral places of significance. Yeah, I think that I absolutely think that probably was happening. I will say, without talking about specific geographies, I mean, there's a archaeological site that I'm aware of through my work with parks and with my work with my boss, Mark Hilkema, where there's a site that was likely an old village site. And I know from just a preliminary look when we're walking around there, we're finding some Chinaware, right? Stuff from kind of more modern era. So I think that's a perfect example. I think hopefully Mike and I will be digging into that, so to speak, and at some point. But I think that was kind of our initial thought. Is like maybe this is a space that was an old village site, and after the mission, when people left, they were coming back and they were living here. And I think that would work probably really well with, I know, the work that Sim has done up north on similar type examples. So I think absolutely. I think there's very likely reasons. The other aspect to that is for the mountains, the forest, that is the Santa Cruz forest up in the mountains here, were really places that the Spanish didn't deal with, and I think it was terra incognita to them, right? They just stayed away from it. And I think it's entirely likely that Native people were leaving the missions, were living out in the mountains. There's some references of doing ceremonies and stuff out there, so I think that seems very likely as well. So yeah, definitely. I think that's an area where we really need to understand more, but I think absolutely these places, continue to be significant to communities. And then Mark has a question here. Much is made about the fact that the Spanish crown had a series of hearings and audiencias where they debated if Indians had souls or not. Eventually they said yes, the Indians had souls and they would become productive Spanish citizens. The Protestants didn't agree, so it was the best Indian was a dead Indian. So the question is, does this make the Catholic Church and the friars look like good guys? Well, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of layers to that, right? I think this debate about whether Native people have souls, it's interesting. I think that what I see is there are letters where priests are writing things like they're saying, all these people died, and they're celebrating it, right? There's this belief that like as long as they're baptized, that their souls are saved. And I think that's and so the debate about whether or not people have souls, I guess in some ways I could see, this is just me kind of thinking about this skeptically, but I could see where it's a justification. Perhaps there's an underlying justification of, if we say they have souls, we can justify baptizing them, making them into citizens. And therefore, if they're dying in large numbers, we're doing a good thing, right? We're sending their souls to heaven, which is way better than them dying. And this is what the priest would say, not me, right? Of course, this is better than them dying, as heathens, right? So I look at that pretty skeptically. Sure, in some ways, maybe they were the good side, in terms that they weren't calling for outright annihilation, but maybe they were opportunists. Maybe instead of it being a benevolence, maybe it's an opportunity where if we fight on behalf of them having souls, then we can make them our labor force. Maybe it's out of laziness, right? Maybe there's a element of, boy, we'd hate to build our own houses and have to do things. And if we didn't have Native people here, then we would have to do our own work. That's me being skeptical, but I think that there's a good argument for that. So I have a hard time seeing them as the good guys. But I appreciate, Mark, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this and have thought about these things a lot. So it's always welcome to see your thoughts on that. Another question here: when did you begin writing this book or start researching for it? And why is it important for histories like these to be documented? Okay, so quite a while ago, this was my dissertation work. So I spent some years kind of turning it from a dissertation into a book. But gosh, I guess I started working on that. Well, it's hard to say. I mean, initial work, maybe 2008 or so, 15 years ago, something. But really kind of, in terms of really writing it out, probably 2012 was when I was writing the first chapter of it. So about a decade of work on that. And why is it important for histories like these to be documented? There is so many mythology. That's a great question. There's so many mythologies around the missions, and there's these ideas, these romanticized notions about the missions that have gained support or have been really the way that we understand the missions for the last 100+ years. And these stories colonialism itself, indigenous presence and histories is denied by names of places like Santa Cruz, like Los Angeles, like all these Spanish names and saints names that dot the landscape of California. These are all erasures of native peoples, right? The accepted story until recently has been that these assumptions, racist assumptions, that native people didn't have a sophisticated culture here. And we know that to absolutely not be the case. And they had a very sophisticated society here that was incredible. So all of this stuff has been erased. I think that it's really important for us to look at these histories to kind of understand the ingenuity of people and understand the sacrifices that people made. I think the stories that people did to make it through these really incredibly difficult times are heroic. They're important stories that I think for Native people, it's important to understand and have understanding of the ancestors and how hard they worked for survival. And for non-Native peoples who are living in this area, I think we have to understand these histories and respect them and understand that the land we're on didn't start with the missions or with the gold rush, and that they go back thousands for millennia. That Native people have been here since time immemorial. And I think we have to understand that if we want to have a concept of justice and respect and understanding in these lands, then we have to start with honoring and respecting Native peoples and learning about them in respectful ways. So yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that. But great question. My favorite part of doing this type of research, I would have to say that I just have gotten to meet a lot of really fantastic researchers and community members. The Native communities that I've worked with in particular. I think that's to me the best part. I'm constantly learning from people like Chairman Lopez, and I mentioned Ed, and so many others, and other scholars and allies who are working in this field. I think I'm really, I feel pretty blessed to be able to be in conversation with a lot of these people, and I think that to me is the best part. I'll segue in as a little plug for my podcast too, which I didn't mention, but I started the podcast about a year ago. I'm co-producing with a friend of mine, Daniel Stoneblum, but it's focused on bringing forth Native voices and different stories that are out there. And this really comes out of that same feeling. I've had all these great conversations, and I realized this is good stuff that people should be hearing about, and that I thought I should be recording these and then putting stories so that other people can also hear about the great work that people are doing and have been doing for a long time. So yeah, great question. And then Alex asked, who do I hope will read my book? Who is my intended audience? Yeah, I'll reiterate, because I do think it's really important what I said in the beginning, is that I hope that people won't end with my book. I hope that people will use this as a inspiration to then go read other important works, and listen to Native peoples who are speaking on their histories and their own stories. I think I hope that my book kind of serves as a gateway for people kind of learning more, right, and digging further into that. But in terms of the audience, it is an academic book. There are thousands of footnotes, as somebody pointed out to me, that are really lengthy. But but I did try to write it as just as approachable as possible. I would like, anyone to read this. I think I think that there are histories like what I wrote that other people could be reading, for in turn, or could be written about any community throughout California. So, but I think if people want to learn about the missions, want to get a better sense of just the realities of these and the ingenuity of people, indigenous peoples, I hope anyone who's interested in that kind of work will read this. So I try to make it as readable as possible for anyone. So I'm not a fan of books that get too academic and are tough to read. I don't like reading those myself. So I tried to write it just as accessible as possible. But thank you for that. I think there were some other questions, but I don't know if maybe they got moved or answered. Maybe I see there's a chat too. Maybe I should look at that. Oh, okay. The podcast is named. Somebody asked about the podcast. It's called Challenging Colonialism, and you can find it on any of your kind of podcast things if you just search for that, including, of course, Spotify and Apple and all those others. We've expanded recently. So, okay, I think, am I kind of at the end? If I'm happy to answer more questions if people have them, but I also don't want to keep people longer. Okay. Hey, thank you all. So let me just close up by saying, as we go to end here, but I just want to thank you again to the American Indian Resource Center, and of course to Chairman Lopez and to the Amah Mutsun for having me. It's been, Val, I just want to echo what you're saying. It's been a pleasure to know you and to work with you. And I learned something from you and from other tribal members every single time. So thank you all for taking the time, and I wish you all well. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can transition here.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Lopez, for being here with us today. And thank you to our amazing speaker, Dr. Martin Rizzo-Martinez, for such a wonderful presentation. If you're interested in having your own copy of Dr. Rizzo-Martinez's book, here are some places where you can get it. It's available online from the Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks, the University of Nebraska Press, and Bookshop Santa Cruz. We have provided the link in the chat. Please scan the QR code on the screen to complete our event evaluation, or use the link posted into the chat. We appreciate all feedback. Additionally, you can be part of 5 lucky winners to receive a copy of Dr. Rizzo-Martinez's book. So please complete the evaluation for your chance to win. Thank you once again to Chairman Lopez and Dr. Rizzo-Martinez for being here with us today. We'd also like to thank the AIRC team and to those that attended today's event. We hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.